So amazing to have all of you, right, from all over the world. We can say good morning, good afternoon, good night, good evening, because we're everywhere, right? So welcome to our Facebook Live and our Zoom meeting. This is the second series of the WONCA webinar, and we are your hosts and presenters today. You have one from the United States, another from Canada, and a third presenter from Australia that is going to join us at the end in a recording for all of us. So it's a pleasure to be here with you. This is the 8th webinar, and we are presenting today from one of the newest special interest group at WONCA, Adolescent and Young Adult Health. So it's a pleasure to be with you. My name is Veronica Svetaz. I'm a cisgender immigrant from Argentina. I'm the product of South American strength and education. And I moved to the United States just to pursue my dream of becoming a family physician with a specialty in adolescent health. I'm the medical director of a family center new approach, right? It's caring for in parallel way for teens and parents. I'm a faculty now at the leadership education and adolescent health at the University of Minnesota, and it's a pleasure to be here with you today. Pierre?
Hello, everyone. I'm Pierre-Paul Tellier, and I'm in fact in Montreal right now. I'm a family physician, and I've done a fellowship in adolescent health in New York way back with one of the people who founded adolescent medicine, who's Adele Hoffman, and came back to Montreal to work. And I currently work at a community clinic, which is called a CLSC in Quebec, and another clinic called Medi-Cal. I have a special interest in adolescent and GLBT health, but I do a broad range of care, and I still do family medicine generally, so that I'd see little kiddies and I see older people as well. So it's a very interesting practice.
And I forgot to mention that I'm located in the United States in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and you heard about us because we were the epicenter of the earthquake with the killing of Mr. Floyd in our backyard. And I mentioned that I also consider myself a scholar on health equity and adolescent health. So with that, I'm going to start, and
Good morning, afternoon, evening. Thank you for taking time during your busy schedule to attend the second series of WONCA webinars. Family doctors around the world have risen to the challenge of this awful pandemic. In the midst of the massively increased workload for family doctors, I'm proud of the level of support and collegiality displayed within and across our member organizations and from region to region. It is heartening indeed. Indeed, the COVID-19 pandemic is bringing a lot of changes to our professional and personal lives. We are slowly adapting to the use of technology to overcome barriers and challenges created by the pandemic. We are getting used to meet virtually and using the cyberspace like what we're doing now. Colleagues are disseminating scientific advice, clinical updates, reflective messages, and professional support through their social media links and connections. They're keeping in touch with each other regularly, like family members, relaying information, urging courage in these extraordinary times. I think all those who participated or listened in our various webinars held in June and July will agree they have been well received and appreciated by many family doctors around the world. I'm really looking forward to the next series of webinars, which will include presentations from our working party and special interest groups on health equity, women and family medicine, e-health, aging and health, complexities, mental health, palliative care, adolescent and young adults, as well as the environment. Before I hand it over to the convener of this webinar, I would like to say that unfortunately, this is a pandemic with an unknown endgame. I wish each and every one of our family doctors well during this time. Use the best advice available, work collaboratively with your teams, do the best you can for your patients. You should stand proud of your contributions in facing the world crisis. No one knows what will be ahead of us in the weeks, but everybody knows enough to understand that COVID-19 will test our capacities to be kind and generous, and to see beyond ourselves and our interests. Our task now is to bring the best of who we are and what we do to a world that is more complex and more confused than any of us would like it to be. May we all proceed with wisdom and grace. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Donald Lee, and thank you, Pere. I have a slide to do like on the second presentation, his introduction, but it's amazing to hear from him, and we want to echo his word and applaud all family physicians who were everywhere, right, covering different aspects of this crisis. So let me now share my screen with you. And I'm trying to share the audio like I did last night. And of course, now I can find the, let me do that again. Here we go. Excellent. So we are here today to talk about sort of like what it's called the 101 on adolescent health. And we are, as I said, a new special interest group. So today we want sort of like to spread the love and to talk about understanding and communicating with teenagers and using like this collide of a strengths-based, trauma-sensitive and culturally informed and culturally sensitive approach. We don't have any interest to disclosure. And again, we welcome just right now our WONCA president, Dr. Donald Lee from China talking to us. So we have, let me change. We have kind of three major goals. And you see like these goals are going kind of from the one-to-one clinical skills to population health and to have a worldview about adolescent health and our care. So the first goal is to understand the basic of motivational interviewing for adolescent care and the strengths-based communication and the effect that type of communication have in teens. And just from the get-go, I will say this, it's an intervention on itself. It's not only a communication style. The second one is to highlight the importance of creating identity and affirming spaces, right? That affirm their gender and sexual preference and affirms their racial ethnic identities. And at the end, we're going to have the president of IWAH, the International Adolescent Association, presenting for us and summarizing a global perspective on adolescent care. So what are the features, right? What is to be an adolescent? Adolescent is this incredibly time of growth, and it's marked by transition, and it's a bridge. It's a bridge to being, it's a bridge of being a child immersed in a family to an adult with independence, with dreams, with goals in their life. I usually say adolescence happens to a family because it restructures the whole family, right? Like a mobile. So we need to keep that in consideration because we are at the perfect position to help adolescents both ways, directly and by helping coaching their parents, which might be another topic in the future. So adolescence is marked by this transformation that it's biological, that it's cognitive, right? Sometimes you have like in front of you a 12-year-old that have like achieved the size of an adult. So when we are doing medication, we don't have to worry about that. But when we are explaining the medication and how to take it, we do. And we need to kind of like try to figure it out in which stages of that cognitive development are they at that moment, right? Because they can totally trick us. Are they in their concrete thinking, or are they more on the developing the abstract thinking and able to reason in a different level? And then we have this incredibly development, right? That it's anchored in identity formation, the emergence of autonomy not as a rebellious autonomy because they are trying to figure it out. Who are they? The main driving force in adolescent health is who am I, and trying to situate themselves in the world. And then this re-engagement on family and peer relationship, that it's crucial and vital in their well-being. You can see that we have, like, people sometimes like to talk about, but it's important. There's an early adolescent years, 11 to 14, middle, 15 to 17, late, 17 to 19, and then young adults, 21 to 25, someone saying now 26, that needs exactly the same support that adolescents. And I will mark this, right? Early adolescents and late and young adult in this transition, they are the ones who will need you the most. So when we think about adolescent health, look at all the tasks, right? Like they have to achieve. It's humongous. So it's like adjusting to their sexually maturing bodies and feelings, developing and applying these abstract thinking skills, and you coaching them, right? On how to learn to do that. Develop and apply new perspectives on human relationship, develop and apply new coping skills, identify meaning, moral standards, values, and belief systems, understand and express more complex emotions and experiences, form friendships that are mutually close and supportive, friendships and relationships that are healthy, establish key aspects of identity. And I love this table because right there you see that one line immersed on these 10 big goals: meet the demands of their mature roles and responsibility, and renegotiate the relationship with the adults in the parenting roles, which is why kind of like family medicine, it's it to help the family navigate this transition. But let's go back to identity, one line, right? And when you open that, it opens like a new world of concepts like they need to achieve. So forming an identity is a lifelong process, right? And includes developing an identity that reflects this sense of individuality, as well as the connection to that group, that where they belong. And they're talking here about all the positive identity around gender, physical attributes, sexuality, ethnicity, religion, and sensitivity to the diversity of groups that make up a global society. But just to give you like an idea about how rich and difficult at the same time this period is, right? So we have this richness, like when we're thinking about doing an intervention, this is probably this is the second stage in our development, that kind of like the return of investment of our interventions are going to be the largest. So one is like between the 1 to 3 years, and then this time around, right? But they're also going to be more susceptible to the influence of the context and the things that are surrounding to them. And so it's important that we take that into consideration, the possibilities and the susceptibility. This is an amazing book done at the Institute of Medicine in the United States, but talking about us in primary care and the missing opportunities, right? And I love the definition about kind of what is adolescent medicine? What are you trying to achieve, right? When you are caring for a teenager, what are you trying to achieve? And they talk about the characterization of adolescents and their health status, but such traditional measure as injury and illness does not capture the developmental and behavioral health of adolescents of different ages and in different circumstances. It's beyond that. Our work, it's not only to prevent injury and illness. Our work is to foster, right? It's to coach them in growth. So adolescent medicine, it's based on the concept of resiliency, and I love that concept because it's totally strengths-based, and it means like that we're coaching someone in that ability to bounce back. So resiliency, it's called your bounce ability. And some people also talk about bounce forward, right? So, and adolescent medicine is anchoring how spaces can help youth develop skills and behavior that will allow them to use their strengths and identities to cope with the challenges that they will find in their life trajectory, wherever they are living, wherever they live, learn, play, and grow. So you're going to hear that we talk a lot about positive youth development, because it's this catalytic way of thinking on how we can protect against all the negative things that we're trying to prevent just by fostering their growth. So I just created this slide to show you, right? What it does, how are we conceptualizing this, right? This fostering real health and fostering their resiliency. And in reality, we're doing two things, right? We are projecting and propelling this positive youth development using their strengths, using their skills, evoking their strengths and fostering their identities. And at the same time, we are screening for strengths and risks, right? And this is something that all academies in the United States and globally, WHO too, right, have agreed that you need to screen for behavior of both sides, strengths and risks, because then you need to coach them, right, using their strengths on how to navigate the potential risks like they can see in their lives. And the reality is, like, when we are doing this, we are preventing this positive youth development, and it's the same for positive parenting. It's known to be a protecting force for all the bad outcomes that you want to prevent, right? From mental health to all the outcomes for sexual health and substance use. So this is truly where you need to focus doing your intervention when you're working with teens. And I love the Lancet, which an amazing Susan Sawyer at the end, she's part of this global force for reconceptualization on adolescent health around the world. They have created this new paradigm shift, right? Where they want to stress out the importance of the context, the importance of the health determinants and their health risks and health problems and their needs, but how we need structural actions. And it's the structural actions and the community actions they are going to influence our adolescent health. And how we have a role in health services, but as you know, the most important piece, 40% of our health, it's determined by this, right? By context. And I love this, like when you're intervening here, you are preparing them to be healthier in their adulthood, but also you're influencing the next generations. So now that we're ready to roll, right? What do we know? What do we know are the barriers to communications? And there was this amazing meta-analysis done, and they kind of identify like 3 different barriers. One is the trust, and the sense of emotional safety was a prerequisite for open and engaging communication. And trust and the interpersonal force, right? Interpersonal relationship with your teen, that connection with your adolescent, it's going to be a mechanism to open communication, but it's also an intervention per se, as we're going to talk about later. It's the importance of having a sense of inclusion and autonomy is fundamental for us to feel that they can share with you who they really are, and to make sure that we're addressing the challenges for sensitive and intimate aspects of our young clients' lives. So how do we do that? So one of the most important ways of achieving or conquering those barriers. It's using motivational interviewing. And hopefully, and most likely, most of you are totally aware about what is this. So I'm probably going to be repeating concepts that you already know, but it's amazing to have a refreshment around this for everyone. Motivational interviewing is this patient-centered. It's directive counseling because you're directing them where to go, right? Some definition, all definition that I remember now, like reading about motivational interviewing, like it's kind of like doing martial arts, where you suddenly put your patient using their own strength in a different situation. So it is counseling style that builds in their intrinsic motivation, not yours. So you need to dig and discover what are they have their motivation inside. You're just allowing them to explore and sharing that with you. And then what you do, it's you signal to them, you affirm to them. See, you are just saying that. So it's an amazing way. To me, it's the way that we should be talking to all the patients, right? And when you start doing this, then you can get out of this, right? That's the way that you communicate with your patients, period. And most of us have relearned about this with the new force of the patient-centered approaches in medicine. So what we know, it's an evidence-based intervention, and we have like studies finding that it's effective for a variety of behavior, decreasing substance use, decreasing risky sexual behavior, facilitating healthy eating behavior, increasing exercise, reducing stress, fewer injuries and hospitalization. And what I want to share with you is like, usually people talk about how motivational interviewing is anchored in sort of like the stages of change for Prosaka, and I love to call it stages of growth. Because one of the main things that you need to do with teens, you're not trying to change them. You're trying to propel their growth. So you need to have, as we're going to talk about that right now, a growth mindset in your brain to be able to foster and coach that growth. So in this motivational interviewing 101, and talking about this growth talk, we are going to name first the relational components. And the relational components, it's what it makes this intervention particularly kind of like perfectly suited in working with teams, right? And it's based, the relational components, we can think about two pieces, right? One is accurate empathy, and the other is kind of like the spirit that it's embedded in motivation and interviewing. And when we're talking about accurate empathy, the first thing that you need to know and to do before you even consider propelling that empathy, right? It's first, we need to check your perception. I want you to check your biases around adolescents. And most likely here, I'm kind of like preaching to the choir, right? If you're listening here, you have already an interest. But when we're working with anyone, when we're working with any group, and particularly for this group, we need to check our biases, and mainly because the society have a long-standing biases. And as we know, in implicit biases, like the bombardment of negative societal messages got into our brain without noticing, right? So we need to make sure like that we are exploring that and we become aware with that. So thinking about like, what are the concepts? What are the ideas that I have about adolescent health? How do I feel about this group? And then remembering from your own growth, how did I feel growing up? What were my own challenges? What do I have from that? What were my strengths? What were the negative pieces that probably can trigger me or build my perception about this group? And that's how can we create that accurate empathy. And accurate empathy means like you are not there just as a cheerleader, right? You are there. Accurate empathy means like you are in that reflective mode that you're really, really present using all the skill that you have for mindfulness. And you have what it's called like this reflexive stance, right? Which is the piece that we need to have with all patients, but particularly with teens, because you're really listening with your body, right? I usually lean forward just to look like smaller and just to signal them that I'm there to listen and not to judge, right? And then you listen with your whole body and you look at all the signs. You listen to what they say. You listen how their body talks to you, and you're continuously reflecting on that. And when you are in that, it's called attunement. Attunement is like when you are connected with your adolescents and they can feel that you're truly, truly listening. And that's an intervention per se, because that's how you start working for teens and with all the patients, right? In their activation. Someone listening to me. So that means that I'm worthy. And that, it's huge. And having that connection and that space, again, it's the most important piece that you wanted to do. Because that's the missing opportunities that we have. The missing opportunities of believing like they're going to come one and then I'm not going to see them again. And that is so false. Because when you create that space and you say like, I want to see you again in 1 month, they come back. They come back and they keep working on whatever they wanted to keep working, right? And then we have the interpersonal spirit about motivational interview. And I have like 3 main sort of like themes. One is you're supporting autonomy. You are taking a collaborative approach, right? So we are a team and we talk about we. And evoking rather than instilling motivation from growth. I usually say, instead of evoking, I usually say mirroring. I'm reflecting, right? Whatever they were saying, whatever strengths I'm seeing. Because the reality, our adolescents are leaders of social change. And if you think about around the globe, they are the one with their passion and their vision, right? Moving and taking the stance and the most important things that we want to conquer in our world. So it's like redialing and changing the perception that we have for them. So there's also principles, right? Like these global principles. I'm going to just name things now, and I'm going to give you at the last like a slide that I have like amazing tool for you to use if you want to dig more and learn more or refresh about what it means to have to use motivational interviewing with teenagers. So there's 4 principles. Like one, we talk about that, right? The expression of empathy, but it's accurate empathy again, like reflecting on what really they're saying, not something like general. Develop discrepancy with permission, like signing like them, hey, so how come? So you have this passion and this dream about becoming like a writer, but you're not paying much attention. I can see that you're struggling in school. Do you need help that? How does it feel with those things to be disconnected? One of the most important one is like roll with resistance. Give the power away. When you feel that resistance because they're not ready, drop it, let it go, and go to the next theme. And support self-efficacy. Always ask them, is that resonating with you? Is that something that is helpful to you? And then we have the technical component. Asking open-ended questions, affirming. I can hear you. I can hear your pain in those words. I can see that you're angry. And this reflective listening, when you're really working with them, listening and then summarizing and doing this technique that is called informing and advising, right? So you elicit, so I can hear that you want to learn more about exercising. Did I hear that right? Yes? Okay. I can share with you what we know about exercising. And then you provide. And then you go back and say, like, is that helpful to you? Do you feel like any of those things make sense for your life? And here you have all the resources that you can enjoy. And now I will pass the baton to Pierre. Pierre, you can say next. I'm going to be changing the slides.
Okay, well, I'm busy typing a response to a certain who was asking questions. So I'll finish that later. So what I'm talking about essentially is obtaining a history from an adolescent and young adult. So you can say it's relatively easy. It's just like everybody else. But as we talked about, as Veronica spoke about, adolescents are in and have to meet a variety of developmental tasks, and where they are in their development will assess or will affect their ability to understand the questions that you're asking, depending on the level of language that you use, will be affect the way that they interpret. So if we're trying to assess their well-being, including their physical as well as their mental health, for example, if we take mental health, frequently what happens is that they really don't have a concept of things as adults do, of what feeling depressed is, what feeling anxious is, and what those actual sort of vague, abstract thinking processes are. So we need to help them, and we need to essentially give them the wording and the tools that they can use to sort of communicate with us. Sometimes it is more than a tool. We need to use a way, a workaround to get to know exactly or to understand exactly how they are working. And the way that we do that is to look how they function in their variety of in their different realms of their lives. And if we see that there's a change or that the functioning is not ideal, then that may indicate that there may be some issues and some problems that the young individual is having. So let's change slides to talk a little bit more about two tools that were developed, or acronyms. When I was doing my fellowship with Adele Hoffman, she actually would interview an adolescent, and she would do that with a group of learners. And she went through all these topics that are listed in these acronyms. But she did it naturally, and it came to her as something that she developed and learned, and that she was passing on to learners like myself. But somebody sort of to just help the average physician and somebody who hasn't spent their time to understand as much as others the development of adolescence, an acronym or two. So the first acronym that was developed was a HEADS acronym. First started with essentially heads, and then a couple of S's were added. However, that approach is essentially a risk-based approach. It identifies risks in individuals. So as you go through these questions and as you ask the young person sorts of identifies and helps you identify the issues that may be going on, but also starts within themselves feeling a little bit bad and saying, is there something wrong with me? Is there something that's happening? And sort of then feeling a little guilty about things that may be happening around their lives. So it was thought that maybe using a more positive approach, so a strength-based approach, would be a little bit more appropriate. So we'll change slides and we'll start looking at each of these letters. This is essentially the whole concept of the questions that one would use. And these are examples. They're not necessarily the questions that you exactly need to use, but if you're using questions or using your own questions, it's important to use questions that are in the same spirit as those suggested in the tools. Again, change slides. So the first questions just go into strengths, and that opens in a very positive manner your interaction with the adolescents. So it essentially asks about the adolescents and how the adolescents is coping on a day-to-day basis, what they like to do, what's positive about their lives, what's positive about what's going on. And the interesting question to me in these 4 questions, in fact, is the last one. Because what it does is it allows you to obtain information about how the adolescent perceives that others are essentially seeing them. Because, adolescents see themselves through the eyes of their peers. And so whatever they believe their peers are thinking about them, essentially will affect how they reflect, how they feel about themselves. So it allows us to find out a little bit more about how they truly feel about themselves without asking that question directly. So it's a way and a workaround for us to get data and information about the young person in front of us. Next slide. Schooling. And you know, how many times when you work with a child who's just begun kindergarten, first thing you'll do when they walk in, well, what do you do? Oh, you go to kindergarten. And how do you like that? Well, we do the same thing with the adolescents, and they are essentially used to those questions. So it's something that they feel comfortable with. It's something that is part of, to them, meeting with a physician. Oh, he's going to ask me about school. What's my best subject? What do I like to do? What's my favorite period? Which is usually for most of them, essentially sports or the recess. So essentially, you know, they always look at this. But what it also does is it starts evaluating their futurality. Where is it that they want to be? Where is it that they want to go? And how much of that is developed. So it gives us an idea of where their abstract thinking development is at. And it opens the door with the last question about whether they feel safe at school for a variety of reasons, whether it is due to the intersectionalities that we just talked about, or whether it's due to the nature of the school, and if there's violence in the school or things of that nature. So it gives us some information about how they define safety, but also how they feel about the safety that they, about how safe it is for them to be in that environment. So next slide will allow us to speak about home. And the home is essentially, you know, where a lot of what is happening is occurring. Now, the questions here are starting to be very broad and starting to be very opened, and do not use language that will compartmentalize people in traditional environments that we imagine. So it doesn't ask about the traditional family, you know, how is your father, how is your mother? It asks, who do you live with? So it allows the adolescents to express their environment, and it doesn't pathologize the environment in which they're living if it doesn't happen to be a male figure and a female figure. So it allows them to feel good about who they are. Then again, you know, the last question is good because it asks them if they can feel comfortable talking to somebody in their family. Is there somebody that they can discuss things with? And if they were stressed, if they're having some difficulty. Of course, stress is a word that they may not understand. So if you may give examples, for example, if you're having difficulty at school with somebody, or if there's a friend or somebody that you know that's bothering you, who do you have to talk to? Who could you go to ask for help? And this is essentially what this question is asking about. The next topic that we look at is, in fact, school activities. So what do they like to do? How do they like to keep themselves busy? Do they have a best friend versus do have a whole lot of friends to which they can't talk to, with which they can't communicate? So it allows us again to sort of, what are you doing to me? It's activities, there you go. It allows us also to understand what's happening to them and how their environment is changing, and allows us to start identifying problems as well. So if they're changing their activities, if their activities have changed, if they're not maintaining them, that gives you a little bit of a red flag. If they are spending less time with their friends and they're changing friends, and it's only a normal process for them to change friends sometimes, but it again means that you need to explore that further. Why has that change been occurring? Why is it that they are changing friends? Is it well, they're growing up and their friends are still little kids and they want to be hanging out with more adult people or people they consider more mature? Or is it that they're hanging out with a group that are involved in doing other things and having risky behaviors? So it helps us identify again some of the problems that may be related to what's happening around them. Next slide. So you then enter into drugs and substances. Now, when questioning this, the principle here that applies is one of birds of a feather hang together. So essentially you ask about their friends. What do the friends do? What happens in the schoolyard? What happens in the environment around them? Do people do drugs? Do they talk about drugs? Do they talk about alcohol? And there's a gradation in which you ask that questions. You talk about cigarettes first. Gee, everybody knows about cigarettes. It hangs around some people's house. Less so now than before, but nonetheless, it's something that's comforting. But it gives them the message that, gee, this is not something that's entirely safe. Then you ask about alcohol, and then you go on to other things such as sniffing glue or smoking weed and using pills, but you don't sort of use the word drug right away because that sort of has a negative connotation. Of course, I don't do drugs, but they do a lot of those other things that can have an impact, but they don't do drugs because to them, drugs is what, some friends may be buying on the side somewhere in a schoolyard. And so that allows you to get more information. The last question is an interesting thing because it allows you to establish their readiness to talk about the subject and to involve themselves in therapy. Because, if they do something and they feel really fabulous, it's going to be hard to persuade them that they shouldn't be really doing it. And so you need to sort of find out how they feel. How does it make them feel? However, if they tell you, well, yeah, I smoke a cigarette, but I really don't like the taste of it. Well, you can just sort of say, well, why do you do it? Because it gives you an opening to start working. And so this is the interesting thing, I think, about this particular question. Next slide. Emotions. Now we're getting to the things that may be a little bit more concerning. Have you been feeling stress? But what is stress? Well, the other questions help us to differentiate that. Do people get on your nerves? And so a lot of them will know what that means. Are you having trouble sleeping? Aha. So when I'm stressed, I have difficulty sleeping. So they start linking these things together. Feeling down and sad are words that they will understand. And then, of course, the final question, which is, have you tried to hurt yourself? Now, again, it describes, it tells you something as to the behavior. In other words, try to hurt yourself is a very concrete thing, as opposed to, have you tried to commit suicide? Some people don't understand what that means, but try to hurt yourself, they do. So you're giving them the vocabulary and using a descriptive term as to what things are doing. Next slides. Eating. And again, it introduces this subject matter from a positive manner. Would you describe yourself as a healthy eater? Then you can find out what they think a healthy eater is, as well as see how they feel about it. The next question is asked about gaining and losing weight. And that's an interesting, again, combination of word. I mean, we always assumed that, and you talk about eating disorders, that means losing weight. But we also have traditionally, but not always, boys who want to gain weight. And so they will try to eat because they want those big muscles. They want those six-pack abs that they see in pictures. And they will try to do things that will try to get them to that body shape, because they see that as normal, because the culture and society pictures that as normal. So they'll try to gain weight, to try to gain muscle mass, but they don't understand that if they eat more and they don't exercise, that they gain fat, not necessarily muscle mass. So we need to sort of give them some more information. Next slide. Sexuality. Well, that's a big word language, and that for me is a lecture in its own. But again, it asks about open-ended question. So are you attracted to anyone? It doesn't say, do you have a girlfriend? Do you have a boyfriend? Do you have a little friend? It just asks, are you attracted to anyone? And then they can define what that means for you, because you then ask to define who that person is. And then you can even ask about feelings. Well, how do you feel about that? You know, you're attracted to a boy and you're a boy. How does that make you feel? And that tells you whether or not they feel comfortable with what's happening around them, and will help you and guide you in what kind of advice that you need to do. If they're not answering, you can just give them the terms. Are you attracted to guys, girls, or both? And then again, ask them whether they're comfortable about that. You then ask them about sex. What do they do? I mean, you start by kissing. It's an easy word. A lot of people kiss. And then you get into other things. Now, I wouldn't necessarily suggest that you use, have you ever had sexual intercourse? Because some of them will blindly look at you and say, what are you talking about? And you say, well, you know, when you're having sex, what do you do? Is a good question. Do you put parts of your body into somebody else's body? And what parts are those? And what do you do? And if it's your penis, do you put a condom on? Where do you put that penis? Things of that nature. So you're asking people to describe exactly what they're doing, so you can identify the risks. And then you can go on to teaching them about how they protect themselves, or if it's a assigned female at birth who's having sex with an assigned male at birth, are they using something to protect themselves? And have you been worried about sexually transmitted infection? Because some people are fixated on that. So you need to help them work that through. You know, the adolescents will come in, the young male adolescents, anything happening down there is a major trauma and is a major emergency. It could be that they've just discovered pearly bodies around the head of their glands, but it's a major, major issue. And you then need to teach them. So it's important that you sort of identify these worries and these concerns. Next question, next slide. Safety, again, you're giving them and you ask them about specific behaviors and about whether they feel safe at school. And then you introduce the question about sexual assault. But again, we're not using that word. We're using, has anyone ever touched you physically or sexually when you didn't want to? So what it does is it describes a phenomenon. It doesn't put a label that they may not use. The other thing that's important is that it links sexual assault with safety, with lack of safety. It takes it out of sex. So it doesn't, because if you keep it and you ask it with sex, in some way you're then saying, well, sexual assault is like sex. We're trying to tell you that sex is good. Maybe not now because you're such and such an age and you can put yourself at risk, but we're trying to have you learn about healthy sexual behavior. And if we ask the questions in that same context, then it makes and tends to make assault, you know, positive in its perspective. And we want young people to move away from that. I mean, when I see young kids in my office who are 5 or 6, and I need to examine their genitalia because that's what we're told we need to do, I always will say to the child, do you mind if I examine you? And then I'll turn to the mother and say, do you mind if I examine Johnny or Jennifer? And then I say, you know, anybody who would want to check you down there should always get the permission from your parent. Now, of course, that's a two-edged sword, because sometimes if the parent is the abuser, that may bonify or may make the abuser sound positive, but nonetheless, it does help you do a variety of things that will help you teach them how to protect themselves. Next slide. So that's back to you.
Thank you. So I'm just going to give you like a glimpse in honor of time, right? And we were talking about identity, and we're talking about sexuality, and I want to bring you kind of like to this idea, right, on how we need to talk about identity and the different things that we mean when we think about who we are. That we are, and so Hayes, it's a psychologist, and she created this amazing tool that it's called addressing, and means like those are the things that you need to be thinking when you're thinking about like fostering or honoring the identity of someone in front of you, but particularly for teens, right? So it's age, generation, the D for special need, religion, ethnicity, race, social status, sexual orientation. We added shape, indigenous heritage, national origin, and gender and identity, right? And keeping that in mind, and also keeping that in your front lobe, right? Because those are the things like sometimes we do have an implicit bias around. But with that, my role today is like briefly mention like the importance of having an affirming spaces to foster ethnic and racial identity, right? The relationship with the values and strengths of our cultural group. And not assuming like someone will have this. So race is a social contract, right? Created to manipulate power in our society. When I say race, ethnicity, and when I talk about racism, you can think about castes, you can think about tribes, you can think about colorism, right? They're all the same, and they're all isms. So how this slide, it's heavy, right? But I'm only bringing that here for you to make sure like that we understand that racial and ethnic identity, it's a late process. It happens here in the late adolescent years and when they are young adults, because they need their abstract thinking. They need their brain developed to understand kind of like what's going on, but also they need that interaction with society to get in contact with all those isms, right? To feel what African Americans in the United States describe as the encounter. When someone single out to you like, you don't belong to the majority, right? And it's influenced by what the parents infuse in that child. So they're coming with this foreclosed, unexamined ethnic identity, meaning I am who my parents are, right? Whatever they're saying there, I belong to, I belong. So it's super important for parents on this process of raising a child in they're like 3, right? To embedding in them that pride and that notion about the strengths and the values and the preference of their group. And we do that from the beginning. You usually say like when you're braiding the hair of your child and talking how amazing that brown or that black hair is, right? And infusing that sense of love and pride about who they are. And then with racial and political socialization, that's what we call the process that their parents are infusing, comes the preparation for discrimination, right? The preparation from the bias and that critical consciousness that it's not about you, it's about that society discriminates and have biases and stereotypes just to manipulate power, and they need to know that, and they need to have conversations about that. So whenever they happen to them, it's not they realize it's not about them, it's about the society trying to infuse a negative image on themselves, and it's like shielding that from that ism and that racism. So The role of racial and political socialization, still pride and values around family, cultural, ethnic identity, to mitigate the self-rejection by developing this critical thinking about the world, right, that surrounds them. And that's the shield. That's the shield when they realize, like, it's not about me. And this racial socialization entails political socialization, the ability to analyze and identify issues of power and authority. And the main psychologist studying this, she's an African American, and the title of her work, or the way that she frames this, is like raising resistors. And at the beginning, I'm like, resistors? What do you mean, right? And then I understood, because she explained the concept. It's raising resistors of internalized racism. And internalized racism, it's a poison of development. So when we talk about racism, sometimes we talk about the structural racism because of the impact, right? But internalized racism is the poison of development, and we should all have been trained around this like forever. And it's right now coming to the front row of science, right? And thank God. So she talks about raising resistors, raising agents of change, because what you are doing is you are letting them know, right? But using that awareness and helping them shift that awareness into pro-social way of responding to that. I give you websites like Embrace Race. Let's raise a generation of children who are thoughtful, informed, and brave about race. And I give you this amazing website called Resiliency, Engaging My Child, and Parent Tip Tool. And if when you go, you have like a guidance on how to do this with parents, because the most important agents of racial and political socialization are the parents, and then us, right? Everyone else that is engaged with the teen. But if the parents are not doing it, the research now shows what you are doing have like a minimal effect, right? Or it might need to be boosted by someone else in order to have an effect. But when the parents are doing it, and then you reinforce that, it expanded like to double. So your mission, your main mission, it's like affirming the space to that teen, but coaching that parent on how to do that, particularly immigrant parents, right? We have like a record of migrant and immigrant shifting in our population. So this is super important. I promise to teach my baby to love your babies, period. And the challenge, like I said, it's not the role of the parents only. And it's how to instill that on the teens while they're growing up. And we are those significant adults. But before doing that, again, we need to do our own research, right? And in identity, and we need to do our own preparation. And why do we care about this in medicine, some of you might ask, right? It's because we know that the cultivation of a positive ethnic identity and preparation for bias, it's contribute to the strong self-esteem and well-being. And that's a precursor, right? When you create and enhance their self-esteem and their well-being, you know that you're going to create like a protective factor against poor mental health of substance use. And it's totally linked with substance abuse and mental health, and particularly mental health. And before you start doing a racial and ethnic socialization agent, you need to do your own preparation. I'm not going to go through this because of time, but I want you to read it. The same thing, it's kind of like uncovering your implicit bias, right? And uncovering for you your own journey and how do you feel about this process, so then you can coach others. And you do it by opening the dialogue. I know that growing up can be rough, interesting, challenging as you try to figure out who you are at so many levels, culturally, vocationally, politically, sexually. Do any of these questions worry you? And the most important one, right? Is race important in your personal life? Is race important at school? Don't assume that this is an important topic, particularly when they're early adolescents, right? They're all about peers, right? They can be African American, they can be Latino. If I ask that question to a 12 or 13-year-old, they will say, I'm an American, because they need to belong. The differentiation and the growth happen later on. So you always start with how salient race is for them. Have you ever been bullied around these issues? Whenever you feel, how do I talk about isn't, think about bullying, because that's what it is, right? And what are the approaches, right? And how do you coach someone about those isms, particularly about episodes of racism? And it's all embedded on things that you know, and the trauma-sensitive interventions and trauma-sensitive responses. So we created this sort of like this pillar and these strategies to promote healing and resiliency. And for one, the main one is fostering positive relationship and connections. And the second is building youth skill, like Pierre was talking about, giving them the tool to consciously name those difficult emotions, giving them names, right? Oh, that is called bias. That's what it's called stereotyping, arising for experiences of racial discrimination and bias. And the most important one, right? Validating the feeling. It hurts. It's for real. It's not in their heads. And so validating their feelings and their emotional responses to such experiences, and using that space to allow them to explore and to do like a self-reflection and to start creating and narrate their stories. And then you use mindfulness to develop their capacity to reflect on their feelings, and using that to start thinking about, so what's next? So what would you do next? What would you do to change the society? It's a role as adults, but what would you do in the future? And then you are using that energy into those pro-social changes that we were talking about before, when we're talking about our leaders in social change as teens. So we developed a whole toolkit. It's another 2 hours of lecture on itself, but you have here, we developed these 2 chapters. I led these 2 chapters with Kenneth Gisborne, who is sort of like the guru of resiliency, and we pledged with the American Academy of P to make those open access. So you go to these websites and all the things are for you to download. Thank you. And now back to Pierre.
Volume on. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use gender, since I work in GLBT health, and whatever else you want to add to that acronym. The word that we've now used, or what we now use, is sexual and gender minorities, which is a little bit more embracing of all the different ways people define themselves, as a template for us to prepare the environment in which we are working with, and to receive clients of different makeups in our offices and in our space where we work. So first of all, let's state that most of us will usually still define gender as being very binary. However, it is not necessarily how everybody does. So not everybody is then put into male-female baskets, but they could be somewhere in between. And a lot of young people are now starting to use that language, at least for us in North America and in Western Europe. So they do self-define as being non-binary, a term that they will appear as use as genderqueer. They can also use transgender or agender, which is essentially somebody who doesn't define themselves in any way. And the reason why we kind of need to identify that at the beginning, and when people come in at this point with everybody, I usually ask, what is the name that you want me to use? And it's interesting because it also does give permission to older women to actually use their married name, which is the name that they often will use. In Quebec, the law is that for all legal documents, they are used their maiden names. And so sometimes you'll walk into the waiting room and you'll call Mrs. Jones and nobody gets up. And that's because they haven't used that name for a long time. So it allows us to use the name that they prefer, which is very good. And then I also go on to ask the pronouns. And we have an electronic medical records, and that has an ability for me to use a pop-up. So I put that in that area where we use the pop-ups, and it allows it to come up so that when another clinician uses the chart, the first thing they see is that pop up and they know how to address the person they have in front of you. It also will impact how we will ask our questions and how we'll talk about them. Because if you're like me and you have learners in the office, the learner will be in the office. And sometimes when you speak to people, you're talking to them, especially in English, and you're using you. That doesn't allow me or doesn't put me in a difficult situation because I don't have to gender them by doing that. However, if I'm talking to somebody else in the room, I do have to gender. And so it allows me to use the proper terminologies. And obviously I work in French as well. There it's even more difficult because there are some words that are very gendered. And so you need to use and try to use the words that are less difficult for the patients that are in front of you. Slide. So the preferred definition for gender identity is each person's internal and individual experience of gender. It is their sense of being a woman, a man, both, neither, or anywhere along the gender spectrum. A person's gender identity may be the same as or different from their birth assigned sex. Gender identity is fundamentally different from a person's sexual experience. Now, you won't find this in orientation, sorry. So sexual orientation and gender is separated. You won't find this in any book, at least not right now. It's a quote that the PhD student that I'm supervising has, or a definition that she's made and is included into her thesis. So we don't really have a reference, but it is something that I think totally describes what we should be using. Now, in other cultures, there are other terms that exist, especially in older cultures and indigenous cultures, where they talk about a third gender. And often a third gender is not so much about actions and behavior, but more about how people interpret themselves, how they live within themselves, and how they define within themselves. So in Canada, we've come up with a word which is called two spirits. And that essentially talks about how and describes how the person is, point of view of their behavior and their comportment. It is about and how they self-define themselves. It's based on an indigenous word of one of the tribes that we have in Canada. The important thing to remember, however, is that it's a word that was created for us, as I call myself, a white colonist. It's for me to understand what they mean by people who are two spirits and this group within their community. So it's not necessarily a word that's used by indigenous people. Some of them do not like the word because it's essentially a colonized word that's made by people who have at period of times in their lives and still do essentially treat them in a very negative manner. And gender expression is just the way that they present themselves. So the boy who wears nail polish or makeup, and the girl who likes to dress in agender clothing. And that expresses who they are, but it doesn't necessarily represent essentially where their gender is at. And that's something that we need to explore further. Next slide. So genderqueer is essentially a word that's used to define those people in between the two binaries. And queer, when you're working with individuals, is a very difficult word to use. At least I find it. For young people, it's a reclaimed word. It's a very positive word. It's a word that they use openly to define what they are and who they are and have pride in. However, for older individuals, me, for example, it's very difficult. It's a very negative word. And when I use it, I never use it to describe myself. And then when I use it and talk about it, I get shivers down my back because it has such a negative connotation. So if I'm a patient with a physician in the office and the physician uses this word and I'm one of the people that I just described myself, essentially it'll be difficult and I may just then close up and decide that this isn't where I want to be and just move away from care from a physician that may be very capable, but I may not want to deal with that physician. So it's important that we remember that, and what we do is we use the language that they use. So the words that they use, asking permission first, but we use the word that they want to use. Next slide. So essentially, in creating a gender-affirming space or a positive space of any kind, what you need to do is, first of all, change your physical environments. It's got to be visual cues, things that people, posters, things that people associate with. So in the youth clinic where I used to work, we had a poster which was very striking to me. It showed someone who appeared male, you know, the beard and dressed as a man. And it says, "I go for my PAP annually." So that poster was a message to the transgendered male that this is something that they needed to do for their health, but it also was accepting. It accepted them as who they were. You need to use the language, and I alluded to that before. Avoid gender, or not avoid, but use gender neutral words. And then the facilities need to be usable and welcoming. So unisex bathroom are the best thing to have in your waiting rooms or anywhere like that. But it needs more space. It's not space friendly. So more often than not, we have a female bathroom and a male identified bathroom. So we can just change the signs a little bit so that they're more welcoming. If I knew that I have a patient who's transgender who's coming in, I sometimes will go meet them very early so that I will stand in the waiting room, and if they need to go to the bathroom and which to go to the bathroom that they identify with, I will wait for them to go to the bathroom and watch and protect them essentially, so that they feel comfortable doing so. You change your walls so that there's no space underneath and things of that nature. So there's a variety of things that you can do. It gives you an introduction to that topic. Next slide. You need to have policies so that everybody, you know, gives and follows the rules and regulation if they like rules and regulation. So it's got to be non-discriminatory. There should be a patient bill of rights that allows them to express themselves and ensures privacy and confidentiality, and also allows them to refuse the care from a learner or from somebody that may be with you. So, you know, I often will introduce people. They come and get the patient with me if I have a learner. But then once we get into the office, I'll say, well, do you mind if this individual stays with us? And, you know, you watch, if they hesitate, I say, you know, you can say no. There's no problem with saying no. And then I've already warned the learner, and the learner then just steps out. They don't show any resistance of any kind. And then there has to be some policies for addressing inappropriate behavior. Next slides. The documenting. So I alluded to the EMR, and the EMR is our greatest and worst ally in this field, basically because the EMR are developed frequently by individuals who are in fact using binary definition or are guided by the requirements of their government. So if your EMR, like ours, is in some way linked to hospitals, linked to the government to allow us for billing, linked for, because we have social medicine, linked to the lab so that things are easily transferred, you have to use their legal name. And their legal name is what appears. So my secretary or my receptionist is stuck because that's what they see on the field when it opens up. So you have to figure out a way to give a message to the receptionist so she knows what to use. Now, the good thing about the EMR, on the other hand, it allows us to gather data, which allows us to then provide more information about young people who are accessing our offices and our clinics and do some research. The forms also can be difficult, because if you print out a form, what happens is it has their legal name. But that doesn't mean that the rest of the form should not be modified. So if I'm asked to write a letter, the letter will be on the letterhead that has, and under the letterhead, their name, their legal name. But then what I can do is, in fact, at that point, do things like change that name, or if they need to have that legal name on the form, I'll talk about the gender that they wish to have within the body of the letter, the name that they wish to use, and refer to them in the way that they want to be referred, which is then very empowering. Next slide. Legal issues, well, it's be ready to prepare appropriate documents. And the other thing to do is to understand about confidentiality. So if you're giving a sick note, then the sick note has to be written using the gender that they present themselves with at work, so that you're not essentially exposing them to an environment that is not used to what they are currently, on how they're currently expressing themselves. So you're not putting them at risk. So you need to be aware of that. Next slide. Insurance. Well, we have socialized medicine. It just means that it's linked, our database are linked to governments, so we're restricted. But under socialized medicine, there's a lot of things that are covered. So people who want to transition can get free medication. They can get coverage for surgery, which is good. I mean, socialized medicine is that socialized medicine as medical people. They are a group that they're not necessarily medical people, but as people who fund things, they like to have diagnosis. So it means that all these individuals then have a diagnosis of gender dysphoria, which is positive because things are covered. It's negative because they're pathologized, and they're continued to be pathologized. So we need to recognize that as well. Next slide. Training, you need to train your staff. Right now we've started a new project in our clinic for GLBT, racialized immigrants, and asylum seekers. And we are training all of our staff not only on how to deal with gender issues, but also how to deal with individuals who are from other backgrounds as patients. And so it sort of extends your training period. It allows for a safer environment for our patients. Next. So interacting with patient, use the appropriate term. During your physical exam, you want to ask. You want to explain what you'll include in the exam, especially if you're going to examine portions of the body that are maybe traumatic for them to discuss. You get your permission from them as you work your way through the exam. So I've developed an approach with patient teachers on how to do a pelvic exam, and we tell the students that they need to explain things as they move their way through the exam. So when I do a pelvic exam, I'll tell them to leave their knees fall off to the sides as opposed to spread their legs, which is considered more aggressive. Then I'll advise them that I'm going to touch them on their genitalia. And I say, do you mind if I touch you? I'm going to touch you now, so that they understand step by step what I'm doing. And if they mind, then I stop. And we try to work out other ways depending on what the goal of the exam is. So if I want to do an STI testing, I don't really need to do a speculum exam. I can just close the curtain, give them the swab, and say, here, take your sample. You take your sample this way. I'll be back behind the curtain if you need me. But if you don't, do the thing by yourself, and just give me the little tube at the end. so that I don't then have to use a speculum, I don't have to touch them, I don't have to do an exam which they consider invasive. So I think that's important to follow. Next slide. And
warm regards to all.
Wait. So the next slide. Thank you, Dr. Tellier. Any other comment? So the next slide, it's Dr. Susan Sawyer from Australia sending our wisdom, and we are done.
Of
Let me go.
warm regards to you all from sunny Australia. I'm so delighted to be able to join you today, but disappointed that I can't do so in person, but I'm afraid it would be the equivalent of about 2 in the morning. So I'm pre-recording this, but when I replay it, I must say that my last sentence always seems to drop off as I change slides, so my apologies for that. What I'm wanting to do in this brief period is really to be reinforcing the importance of what Veronica and Pierre-Paul have been sharing, and to be widening that perspective to share some of the global challenges to the provision of quality care for adolescents that really come because of a lack of availability of teaching and training, and also of legal frameworks. So that the question that really comes to mind is, what difference would it make if this consultation shown here occurred in Australia or in any other low or middle income country? In a country like Australia, very similar to the States, Canada, Western Europe, there is a pretty reasonable understanding that health professionals have of some of the ways of working with young people. But in most other parts of the world, this is not the case. And it is particularly challenging then in some highly stigmatized contexts, which, whilst challenging in the States, I know, in relationship to just thinking about access to abortion, but are even more challenging in low and middle income countries. So if this young woman here had an unmet need for contraception, being unmarried, if she or he had thoughts of self-harm or HIV positive, experiencing substance abuse, sexual abuse, interpersonal violence, what would the quality of care be available to us as health professionals if we lived in particular countries? What I can say is that it would be much, much less. I mentioned the importance of some of these elements that are, and I'm not going to go into the detail, but these are the sorts of things that Veronica and Pierre-Paul will have been talking about: the importance of attending to the adolescent in the context of their family, understanding what are the components of quality care that are required to be delivered, and what's the policy and procedural context of that, particularly in relationship to privacy and confidentiality, and having, if you like, a developmental preventive orientation. But none of that can take place unless we have legal frameworks that support quality practice and without an appropriate investment in professional education and training. Laws are increasingly in my mind because I'm just increasingly aware of how both constraining they are on the quality of care that we can deliver, as well as how empowering they are when we get it right. So, for example, we can all appreciate that if it is legal for a young girl to get married at the age of 14 or 15, as it still is in many parts of the world, then this can be one of the most damaging aspects of her future health and well-being. We can appreciate that the impact of decriminalising homosexual behaviours is incredibly powerful in terms of health and well-being for young men and women. We can appreciate the importance of age of consent to medical treatment, including the provision of contraception, both to married and unmarried women. Laws and sentencing about sexual assault, and it's been in the news around India and Bangladesh recently, availability of legal abortion. Things like that you might not automatically think of, but driving laws, given that motor vehicle accidents for cars and motorbikes are one of the most prevalent cause of death in young men in particular. Legal frameworks are incredibly important, and as health professionals, with the authority that we have a very powerful voice in our communities that I'm afraid we don't use, I would believe, sufficiently often. And I just really want to highlight, though, that laws are themselves not enough, but it's how can we use laws, how can we ensure that we develop laws, but they are then implemented and that we can bring our communities along with us. Because Nelson Mandela promised when he was inaugurated in 1989 to build a society in which all South Africans will be able to walk tall without any fear in their hearts, a rainbow nation at peace with itself and the world. And following his inauguration, South Africa was really the first country in sub-Saharan Africa to implement a range of very positive laws in relationship to supporting gay marriage and also decriminalising homosexual behaviours. However, in 2018, I think it was, this woman, Betty Malamo, is holding a photo of her daughter, Pasca, who was killed. She was murdered as a young lesbian South African, which is too common a fate of both young men and young women in South Africa, as it is in the rest of the African subcontinent, as well as in many, many parts of the world in which homosexuality is still illegal. I just want to change tack now to look at the burden of disease from a global level and to think then about what are the sorts of health needs that young people face across in different parts of the world, and what then is the requirement in terms of the teaching and training for healthcare professionals and the laws that are required, including around confidentiality to support them. As part of the work we did in the Lancet Commission, we divided up all of the the ICD-10 codes into these 9 groupings. And then country by country, we looked at the DALY number per 100,000 of 10 to 24-year-olds, so the disability adjusted life years of these 4 conditions: infectious, vaccine preventable diseases, undernutrition, HIV, and sexual and reproductive health, which was predominated by premature maternal mortality. And so we then divided up countries, and on the next page I'm going to show you some world maps which are looking at where the countries fit into, or into which of these 3 types of countries each country is grouped into, with the appreciation that with growing wealth there is an epidemiological transition. When we see that then here, we can see that the multi-burden countries are on the far right, with a slightly higher burden in 1990 to 2010, with females and males on the left and the right. And we can see by definition this excess burden of disability adjusted life years from HIV/AIDS in purple at the top, infectious disease or vaccine preventable conditions next, sexual and reproductive health, and then malnutrition. Injury excess countries are countries largely in Latin America and the ex-Soviet Union countries, and we can see this perhaps surprising pattern of male disability adjusted life years, male disease burden, very much by violence and injury. This is homicides, this is gang violence, and this is accidents. And then we can see in all countries underneath this huge green swathe of chronic physical disorders, mental disorders, and substance use disorders. So when we think about teaching and training, and when we think about laws, we're really needing to match these with the relative disease burden experienced in different countries. So if we were to ask a question, to what extent has health really improved in young people from 1990 through to now, we can see on this graph that it doesn't look like it's particularly improved. Go back a slide. In these purple countries, there is the biggest, if you like, gap where we see a failure of teaching and training in adolescent health. You know, these are the countries that have got the largest population proportion of adolescents, and they've got the least teaching and training on adolescent health, and they also have the most restrictive laws. I, together with colleagues, George Patton at the Centre for Adolescent Health, we've developed this free massive open online course, or a MOOC, that runs 4 times a year, in order not to be educating people in Australia or in Canada or in the States, but to try and at least have some, Adolescent Health 101 available to people all over the world. So certainly this is a course that continues to run regularly. I would encourage you to distribute that through to your networks and encourage your students to sign on. But I think what you can do to be promoting better quality health services for adolescents is really thinking about your own service you work in, whether it's a family medicine practice in the community, or whether you work in a teaching or education role in a university, whether you work in a hospital, but really thinking about how are we building back better, so to speak, to use COVID speak, in terms of our next generation of trainees. How are we investing in education? And the only way that we're going to be developing policy statements on things like confidentiality, on the importance of routine psychosocial history taking, is when we do that through professional associations, whether that's through WONCA with its new special interest group in adolescent health, and I'm so thrilled with Veronica and Pierre-Paul taking on this role, whether it's through my own Australian Association for Adolescent Health, or through the International Association for Adolescent Health, the US Society for Adolescent Health and Medicine. I would commend any of these professional groups to you, but being part of a broader grouping is absolutely one of the ways that you can have the confidence then to be developing with like-minded colleagues the sort of education material and policy statements that will be really making a difference. And I commend these to you. Best wishes.
Wow, wasn't that amazing, right? And thank you, Susan. And Susan, for reminding us, right, that global health is really global health equity. And with that, we know that we are far over time, but we took advantage. This is flexible, and we wanted to share with you a little more, as we were not able to be part of the first round of webinars. So here we are. So any questions, any ideas? Here you have both the emails of Pierre-Paul and myself to join our WONCA Adolescent and Young Adult Health Special Interest Group, and we will love to have your energy with us.
Please contact us if you want to join us as part of the group and contribute to what we're doing. And thank you to everybody for attending. Time to go, Veronica?
Yeah, I don't see any questions on the...
Oh, I've been answering them.
Oh, perfect. So...
The only question I didn't answer totally, because we don't do pre-screening in our clinic. Do you have a pre-screening tool that you use with your clients?
So we use, because we're like a clinic within a clinic, we use the GAPS questionnaire. But I do believe it's kind of like what Susan was saying, like depending on where you are, you need to look for a questionnaire that it's strengths-based, but also like targeting the needs, the local need of your teens. And particularly that they have the wording and the vocabulary about things that are going on in their life. There's like a new set for countries that have electronic medical record. There's the availability now for teens to do on their cell phone and on their iPad some electronic questionnaires that are interactive. So knowing like there's an interest about artificial intelligence, right? And that's what I see, kind of like more like the explosion, like they're interactive with different algorithm and doing some interventions with them, like teaching them at the same time. So, and they're short and easy to use. They need to be used kind of like in the clinic for safety, because you want to control like they're doing that by themselves, right? Even a paper questionnaire or an electronic questionnaire, and you want to control like there's something around safety, particularly hurting themselves and suicidal ideation, that you're there right at the present moment to answer that piece, right? And there's two tools that we can send the links to the tool, one coming from Michigan and another one coming from Seattle in the electronic version. But what I will say, Bright Futures have a tool, but I don't want anyone, right, particularly from our South hemisphere, to use any westernized questionnaire and to try to look for questions or ways for you to validate the questionnaire that have a ecosystem lens, that are strengths-based, and that are somehow screening for the things that you see prevalence in your own community. But I do believe like it's a crucial part of adolescent health, because particularly when they're like shy, right? It's easier when you're responding to a paper than sometimes when you are like talking for the first time to someone. So having the pre-questionnaire then allows you to rehearse, right, the screening that you're doing, but you know where are the pieces that you need to zoom your intervention that day, and also you gave them more privacy to answer those pieces.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions, unanswered questions? So we'll have the recording of the webinar ready for you, right? And then we have the next slide.
So this slides tells us about the next session, which is part of this webinar series, and it will be on environment, which is a very important topic for both our adolescents and ourselves. So we encourage you to attend. It will be on November 15th. And at this point, we don't have an hour, which is why you don't, or time, which is why you don't see that posted. So we encourage you to attend that webinar.
So thank you so much for attending and allowing you to be with you in our first webinar with WONCA. And thank you IWAH for this partnership that hopefully will be ongoing.